you are not just trying to fix their finances, you're trying to fix them. And that's never going to work. You can't fix somebody that way, and they're not broken to begin with.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Rich and Regular podcast, where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Julian. And today we're talking about conflict and how to fight fear when it comes to money. But first, we're going to switch it up. I'm actually going to read an email that we got. We've actually received a couple of emails. Shout out to the spam folder because a couple of them landed in there. And I typically just ignore that, let it build up for a while. So it's been like a week or so. And I found a couple in response to Money on the Table. This one was actually in response to a couple of them. It said, "Words cannot sufficiently express my gratitude for your diligence and consistency in your work. And I am over the moon about the old/new format of Money on the Table. I cried when you interviewed Julian's mom, which was season 1, I think. Yep, season 1. And when Kirsten described our living in a, quote, permission society and how that manifested in our lives, which was a recent episode in season 3. Simply true and deep. I just listened to Cashing Out, and it restored my interest in nonfiction audiobooks. In 2018, as a 69-year-old woman, forced out of a government job by a white male boss who wanted me to call him, quote, boss man, I can personally attest to the truth of all you teach and share. I checked all these unprepared for retirement boxes and have put in an effort to turn my attitude and my money around so that I now live my best rich life. Blessings and faith in all you do, Jacqueline."
Boss man.
Well,
that's wild. But thank you, Jack.
That is wild. Yeah, I could. This is a podcast episode in of itself. But thank you, Jacqueline. I've never met a Jacqueline I didn't like.
Me neither.
You know what? I take that back. There was one I didn't like. But all of the other Jacquelines make up for that one Jacqueline, and this one is no different. So thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you to everyone that has watched, that has listened, that has supported the show, that has supported our video series and the book and all of those things that we've been doing over the years. We try to be intentional, and so it's really good to know when people really, really get it. Yeah. Okay. Why are we talking about conflict? There are a couple of reasons why we're talking about conflict. Personally, for me, I was a little triggered. I had a, what do they call it? I was a fly on the wall. I was within earshot of a recent argument with a couple. It wasn't specifically about money, but like I had almost forgotten that this is something that people do. And I was a little shocked that it was happening like in a public space. So I was like, wow, you know, like not to brag, but like, wow, I could not believe that couples like still kind of bickered that way. But I obviously can't believe it. 2, I want to debunk the myth right off the bat, right? There's this saying of like being on the same page. And I think people define, or the benchmark for like being on the same page means you never have an argument.
Right.
And that's not true, right? That is not true. We're going to talk about that a little bit. The third one, though, is because it feels like in the recent months or so, like there's been like this uptick in all of this content that's around couples and them arguing about money, and this person says this and the other person says that. And I am just like, this is, maybe it's because it's political season, but I am just like increasingly sensitive to ads that like divide people, or content really that just divides people. And there's just so much of this like me versus them, us versus them, men versus women, Beyonce versus Taylor Swift. There's so much like of this comparison. Like a lot of that stuff going on. And so I want to talk about that. Obviously, that's not like exactly why, but like I do feel like there's something up in terms of conflict being such a, I'm going to use your word, kink for content right now. Like, so that's part of the reason why I want to talk about it.
Yeah, there's definitely something that editors and media publications are looking for, the most salacious version of something. You can't just tell a story within its context. It's like you got to compare it to something that other people love to trigger that sense of conflict in people. And we know that's intentional when it comes to media, but I don't think we realize how that shows up in our relationships. Like when you consume that all day, your interpersonal relationships often have that same flavor. You can't just ignore it. And so you may not know that you're purposely flicking your partner or purposely jabbing at your friend or whoever it is, your parent, but that's what it is. And to me, that's how I define not fighting fair. Like, you're hitting below the belt.
Yeah.
You know, even in the most violent sports, there are some rules where it's like, you can't hit people in the soft spots.
Yeah.
Like, you gotta make sure that you're fighting fair. I want to talk about this because we brought it up on the podcast. It was 2 episodes ago when we were talking about money on the table, and we talked about this unseen footage of this argument that we had.
Yep.
And as I reflect on all of the places where conflict has come up around money, it's usually around a life milestone. We're either, getting married, or we're about to have a baby, or we've bought and sold some real estate, or when we've had to say no to somebody or something. I wouldn't even say had to say no, chosen to say no.
I think it's the moment when you are kind of forced to work together because you walk into that decision under an assumption that the other person or the other party has a shared interest or is, as they say, on the same page. And it's not until that major decision or obstacle needs to be removed that you realize that the other person sees it a little differently.
Yes.
And that's, I think, the thing that's why it's like so centered around all these major milestones. Because it's like, well, wait a second. I know we said this is what I meant when I said a bigger house, not this, or not what you're talking about, or this is what I meant in terms of how we're going to raise a child, or what I thought a dream wedding meant. And so all of those things, I think, are met at this intersection, and that's where a lot of the collisions happen.
Yeah. Even if we're not talking about a romantic partnership, anytime you do something with your money, there's somebody that's going to take it personally.
Yes.
And so this episode is for people who want to preserve the relationship, because fighting fair really starts with beginning with the end in mind. Yeah. It's knowing that at the end of this, we still got to kick it. Yeah. I'm still going to ask you if you're hungry. And so I might not want to try to take you out.
You could end the podcast there, because I do think that is the end of the day argument, right? Like, we all got to be here. Your family is your family, and hopefully you see your partner, your life partner, the same way. And I think that's the thing that, as obvious as it seems, is often overlooked. But you also brought up another point that I think is important, and I'm pretty sure we'll get to it. We're not just talking about romantic relationships here, right? Like, we're talking about partnerships, which, going back to money on the table, we do talk about that as well, because that oftentimes gets overlooked. So this is not just for the couples. This is not just for the people who are getting ready to get married. This is for anyone who is in a relationship, whether it's a familiar relationship, an intimate relationship, a sibling, whatever it is, like
a professional
relationship. Yeah. It's about all of those things. So, okay, let's dive into it. My first observation, I have several, but I'll structure them in this way. The first one is that I think most people are never taught how to argue about money, which kind of makes sense, because most people aren't really taught how to talk about money and arguing.
Or how to argue in general.
Right? Like, I've actually read a couple of books. I've actually given some people some books who I think have struggled with this. And I was like, you know what? I think you might actually benefit from this. But most people are just never, even if we're not talking about reading books or being taught these things, they've never really been in an environment where conflict resolution is something that was required, right? So you think about someone who maybe has worked in a customer service role. Like, that person is just quite naturally better equipped at dealing with conflict. Like, somebody comes at them, says something really, really crazy, and your literal job, is to calm them down and to find a path towards a resolution in a really efficient manner, right? I think about myself. I remember when I was waiting tables, I was in grad school and I was waiting tables while working another job at the school. And that's really when I started to learn it, because I did not expect that at all. I walked in thinking I know just about everything about food there is to know. Any question you've got to ask me, I'm going to be able to answer it. And I learned very quickly, like, it was not about what you know.
Right.
It was about how you say it. It was about your ability to meet these unspoken expectations. It's about your ability to understand nonverbal communication, and to be able to go from one person who expects to be delivered white glove service to another person who really just wants to be left alone. And both of them want to be pleased at the same time, along with 5 other people. And they just want it to happen without having to explain themselves. And so for me, waiting tables, and that's one of the reasons why I really treasure that period of my life, was one of the most important periods, I really say, for my life. And there was one particular value. I worked for a company and they had a long list of values, like no different from other companies that have like a mission statement and a vision statement. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was one of their values, which was courageous conflict resolution. And First of all, I'm a sucker for alliteration, but like I loved that because it meant it went both ways. They weren't just talking about when guests come into the restaurant. They were also saying within yourself, right? Because you need to work with your fellow servers and the kitchen staff and all those people in order to make sure that everybody has a good time. And so all of those things, I think, helped train me. Obviously, being a parent, and having to communicate effectively with a child as they are aging, and then as they are growing up, trying to teach them how to communicate. Like, it's one of the first,
and how to model it.
Well, that's the thing. Like, that's the beauty, at least one of them, of parenting, is that as you're trying to teach a child something, you now have to show your understanding of that thing. And so sometimes I have to stop and I need to teach him this thing tomorrow, but let me just make sure I have my ducks in a row. I know what I'm talking about so that he doesn't go off the deep end or just completely disregard what I'm saying. But this summer, that was one of the things that I really wanted to teach him was communication and how to structure his argument, how to get what you're asking for. Not saying that if you do these things that you're always going to get it, but you state your case, you tell me why, you give the best reasons for why you want that thing or why you think you should have that thing. And sometimes it's not about just why you may have it. Sometimes it may be because it's going to help me, right? So being mindful of the other person and using their experiences and the things that they want to actually help you get what you want. And so it was interesting to kind of break that down, because I was like, wow, I really, teach this boy everything. I'm fine with giving you these things, but that's just not a good reason. So let me help you out a little bit.
So is that how you learned about conflict, was through waiting tables?
I think so. I think my earliest, I'll certainly say my master class. I mean, obviously there was just my general dating experiences, but that was probably a crunched time, like a master class, really dealing with conflict and time management and, doing all of those different things. But when somebody is coming at you, I mean, listen, shout out to the people who waited tables out there. And I'm talking about at a high level with really high expectations and not just expectations of your understanding of food and wine and beverage, but just on finesse and navigating certain social circles and unspoken expectations. That is really, really difficult. There's a reason why people do it professionally and they make pretty good money, because it's really, really hard to do. And I did that for about 5-6 years. And it helped me in more. I mean, every time I start to disregard that experience, something always happens that reminds me how valuable that experience was.
I think the same way about my stint in retail and management. I mean, I was leading teams of 20 as someone who was younger and less experienced. And I don't think I ever thought about how that was also a lesson in conflict resolution, because I attribute my first lessons to having a sibling, having a brother, and having to grow up and share resources and bathrooms and snacks and back seats. And then also I was one of those hall monitors in 5th grade. I think they called it the safety patrol. But, they select a couple of 5th graders to stand in the hall and make sure that kids aren't fighting during lunch, that kind of thing. And through that, I had to take this certification in conflict resolution. And I thought I was just
what kind of school was this?
This is an elementary school.
Take a certification for.
I mean, I'm probably exaggerating. Now, it might have been just a little ridiculous class, a little hour-long thing. I just remember leaving my class to go get this little conflict resolution class and feeling like I was better than everybody because I understood how to diffuse a fight or an argument.
And you talking about it like you better than everybody.
But this is my point. I had the orange badge.
I bet you, I was about to say, you probably had a badge.
But my point is, I still became conflict avoidant because at home, the way that conflict was handled was fear-based. So it was not like you where you're explaining the mechanics and blah, blah, blah. First of all, I was a church girl. My mama had me in church several days a week. And so I was scared of going to hell. That was my reason to not create any conflict anywhere in my life. And that started very early. I was just well, I can't do that. I can't do that. No, you can't do that. We can't do that, because of what I learned in church. And then second of all, my dad was a yeller, and I just developed this sensitivity and this habit of covering my ears. Now, he naturally speaks very loud. He's an old Black man from Texas, but he was also a yeller when he would get upset. And that was scary to me as someone who couldn't make my voice do the same thing, or, just didn't have that level of anger in me. And so I still ended up, despite my 5th grade achievements, still ended up being very conflict avoidant, which if you've read our book, you know that was the origin of our story and our ability to get on the same page.
Yeah. I think, it kind of goes without saying, but I'm willing to bet a lot of people have never really thought about it. If you haven't worked certain jobs, if you haven't had or certain experiences, maybe you didn't have the privilege of being the hall monitor, maybe you didn't have the privilege, maybe you grew up in a single parent household, right? Even something just like that, there wasn't another person where you could actually see conflicts being resolved, or whether it's being done well or poorly. All of those things don't really help you. And so you grow up not really knowing how to navigate those things, or learning different tactics, whether they're good or bad, right? And so I think a lot of us kind of learn on the go. We learn in our relationships. And again, some of us don't really have extensive dating experiences. And so it just compounds. You end up being an adult. You end up being in this relationship, and you have this very romantic perspective on how things should be, going back to what we were saying around avoidance being the benchmark for how well a relationship is going, the absence of conflict being this marker of success. And it's not until you have that first conflict that you start to realize that probably was not the best way to do it, that there was a lot of avoidance going on in some of those cases. So
there's a couple of reasons why fighting fair is hard. I think one, everything we just said, everything we just talked about. Then there's nature, which means our brain is just hardwired to react to negativity. And so we perceive disagreements, just simple disagreements, as an attack. It makes us defensive, and it makes us more prone to have these emotional reactions instead of just understanding that it's a disagreement. This person has a different opinion about the thing than I do. Then there's nurture and just the pace of change. The expiration date on narratives right now is quicker than ever. Storylines used to last for centuries in the United States. Now, you good for 5-10 years if you're lucky. And then you're more likely now to meet people who have different backgrounds, or are from different regions, or have different experiences than you were ever before, because of the internet, because of advances in travel. The likelihood that you're talking to somebody who grew up in a totally different climate, ate totally different foods, has a totally different burger place, that's all way more likely than it was before. And so conflict is more natural now than it has been in the past few centuries, when we only had one television channel and everybody was watching the same thing at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. Now it's very different because people get their information from different sources. And then on top of that, when you add money to the mix, money arguments are very rarely about money. Disagreements about how to spend money, how to save money, how to invest money, it's usually based on some deeper anxiety or insecurity about control or trust. And most people just don't have the range or the training to handle that.
Yeah, I'm gonna double click on that last part, which is the training, because what happens is, and I'll give a very real example. If you've only learned about money from, let's say, a parent, right? That becomes the gold standard. What they did or what they're doing becomes the right way. And so now you end up in a relationship. And to your point, this person maybe grew up somewhere else, a different household, different socioeconomic status, different aspirations, etc. And they've got a different approach or suggestion or recommendation on why you should do something, or why we as a unit, as a family, as a couple should do something. And that almost immediately feels like a knock against not just you, but not only are you wrong, but you're saying I'm wrong. And what my mom and what my dad did, the things that got me to where I am, are wrong. That's what it feels like sometimes. And I think we oftentimes misunderstand that person, the rationale, put it into context, because we don't really understand the backstory. And let me just pivot for a second, because you have a knack for doing this. I can be watching a show. It happened this morning. I'm watching a show and you're not watching the show at all, but you come downstairs during almost every time, during one of the most pivotal moments of the show. And I always stop and think all right, am I going to press pause and try to explain it to her? I was maybe I do. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But the point is, you can't really understand the conflict, the tension that's happening, because a lot of times, especially in something like Game of Thrones or House of Dragon, it's so subtle. You don't really understand what's happening here without understanding the backstory of these characters, or without understanding the context of why what they did was so dramatic. And I think the same is true in real relationships. You can't understand the conflict. if you don't understand that person's backstory. And if you've never gotten to understanding that backstory, and I don't just mean the version of the backstory that they told you.
Yeah.
I'm talking about...
You got to get the the collection of backstories.
This is who they told you. I'll use you as another example. She told me she was good at basketball.
I was.
Okay. My standard for being good at basketball...
I ain't playing no Rutgers.
I'm just saying. My standard for being good at basketball was different. I'm not saying you were a scrub, but I took you at your word until we went on the court. And I was like, oh, now I know what she means by good at basketball. And again, by your standards, I bet you were pretty good. By New York City standards, and that's not really a diss. I'm just saying, like, New York, we talked about this. The culture of basketball in New York is so different and so high. So for you to say that you were good at it is very different from someone to say that they were good at it in New York or in some other part of the country where like basketball is the thing that you do. Yeah. And so the same is true with money, right? And that's the point that I'm making here, and I'll land there. Like, you got to understand the backstory. You've got to understand the context. You need to probably get not just their highlight reel, but get the other person. Well, they said they did a 360 dunk. I was like, who else is on the team? What did they say?
How high was the goal?
Well, it was a layup. Okay.
Was it in a game or
we
practice?
Can meet somewhere, right? You know what I mean? And so you put it all in context, and I think that's the thing. But like, you get that when you meet the person's family, and not on the first visit. Sometimes you do, but like the third time, the fourth time, that's when you really start to understand who they were when they were growing up. And as a result, I think that helps you and makes you better equipped to navigate those kinds of conversations. But we oftentimes don't get there. And so if you don't have that backstory, like, that conflict comes in really, really harsh.
I think what you're describing is what I call the dynamic between two people, right? It's what one person assumes is normal and what the other person assumes is normal. And most arguments are because they don't assume the same things are normal. Right? Nope. I assume that it's normal to have food left over from your plate and to throw it away if you don't finish eating it. You don't think that's normal. For you, that is waste. You got too much food, you didn't eat it, and now it's being thrown away.
Oh, yeah.
That is the baseline of a conversation. We assume that the topic or the subject matter sets the tone for the conversation, but it's really the dynamic. And we tried to explain this in Cashing Out. We actually borrowed from Dr. Sue Johnson's concept of conflict as this dance.
Yes.
And it's where one partner makes a move, the other partner responds, and the rhythm and communication style between the two of them shapes this dance. Now, our emotions act as the music in the dance. And so for the dance to actually be successful, both partners have to be emotionally attuned. They need to be aware of each other's emotions and try to understand the other person's feelings to make sure that one person ain't twerking while the other person is waltzing because they hear very different music because they're in different emotional states.
Yeah.
Now, the conflict occurs when people are dancing to different songs. So if one person is trying to calm a situation while the other person is trying to dominate the conversation, it's not going to work. You're not going to have this successful dance. And we were talking about us and our marriage in the book, but the framework actually applies to any type of relationship.
Yeah.
You learn to see this conflict as this third thing. It's not something that is a reflection of you as a person or me as a person. It's the mix between the two of us.
You know, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier, and I really want to highlight a different example around multi-generational or like familiar relationships. Because when you think about money, right, obviously what you're doing, let's say your approach to investing is going to be very different when you're early in your career versus what you may be willing to do when you're later on in your career or maybe nearing retirement. Same is true for how you're actively earning income. The kinds of jobs, the things that you're willing to do to earn money are going to be very different depending on where you are in your life. And so for the people, and I'm kind of projecting here a little bit as I'm thinking about myself, but I know we have a lot of listeners who are financially supporting their parents. You have to think about like not just like the cultural and social dynamics and like the context, but like what your parents think should be done or what is considered a smart decision or a right decision for them, even as they are requesting support, is going to be very different for what you consider to be a smart decision. They may be wanting to solve a problem now, immediately. You may be thinking about the future problems, and they're like, I don't even know if the future's going to be here.
Right.
Like, I'm more concerned about this week, this month, like right. Max. Like, you over here talking about 5 years from now. I don't know that I'm going to make it.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And so the way that they're thinking about it is going to be a little different. Both of you are right. There's not a wrong decision there, right? Whether we're talking about paying for a surgery to try to make a pain go away, or we're waiting because we know there's some type of experience or, long-term care plan that's going to require some funding. Like, you need both. They're both good decisions, but the way that both of you kind of approach it, and as a result, like, that opportunity for conflict is going to be pretty high because you're looking at it from different perspectives. Obviously, one person is experiencing that discomfort a little bit more, but it's not to disregard you as the person who is supporting. You love that person. You care for that person. You feel something too when you know that they're struggling, but you're just not feeling it in the same way. They're feeling it in the hip and in their knee, and you're feeling it in your heart and in your head because you empathize with that person. So yeah, it's all of these things, right? Emotional attunement is not just going to be, something that's between you and that partner. Going back to this relationship, like, that person may be hearing like really urgent, heart pounding music, and you're kind of thinking like, I mean, we're getting there, but like, we're not quite there. We're both listening to the same song, but this person is like, after the bridge, the song was about to be over, and you're like, man, we got at least 2 more verses left. We ain't got to hit the high note right now. We can coast a little bit.
Yeah, we try to let it breathe a little bit.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing, and I just think it's something that people should be mindful of as they're, trying to navigate all of the relationships and all of the financial decisions that they need to make with these relationships in mind.
I think that's the nature of complex issues. There is no singular right answer. There is no solution that satisfies everyone. We turn to our ideologies, whether it's biblical or spiritual or some other belief system, and we assume that that is the thing that has the right answer. If the Bible says these 10 things are wrong, then these are the 10 things that are wrong for everybody. But we don't acknowledge the freedom and autonomy that people have to believe what they want to believe.
Yeah.
And because of that, there's never going to be this like perfect little bow of closure and satisfaction. You might get moments of that, but it's not forever.
Yeah, it makes me think of a former coworker that we had who I remember being very frustrated because our boss at the time really wanted her to develop a PDP. And he was asking her, where are you going to be 5 years from now? What do you want out of this position? How can I help you get there? What are the classes and the things that we need to be doing to make sure that we get there? And she was like, I don't want to do none of that. Like, she was like, I just kind of want to groove. And everyone else was kind of like, well, I would say most of us were kind of like, all right, well, fine. There's one less person we need to compete with. And we were grinding. We're like, this is what I'm going to do. This is where I want to be. This is my path to being a VP and all that kind of stuff. And I think the same thing happens in relationship. To your point, that is a relationship dynamic there because there was some tension there. It was like this boss wanted to be able to say, I want to help you get somewhere. And this person was like, I actually don't want to go anywhere. Like, I'm actually fine right here, kind of coasting, and I don't really want to go or fly much higher to the sun than I am right now. And I think it just kind of goes to show that like they just had, they're on the same page. Like, I'm going to do everything that I can to accomplish the objectives, but all this other stuff I'm not really interested in. And it kind of created some tension. It was like, all right, well, I'm not interested in working with or employing someone who doesn't have higher aspirations because they just had, in some cases, different goals. And I think the same thing happens in relationships, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, we could work together. This seems like there's no issue, but except for this one little thing. It was like, well, why is it that you don't want more?
Yeah.
And this other person is completely satisfied where they are. And I think, not everyone, I don't want to say like wants more. It's not really about wanting more or wanting less or being satisfied, because there's nothing wrong with being content or satisfied. I think what we're talking about here is like this idea of closure and definitiveness, and there being A or B, this or that. It's like sometimes it's perfectly fine to say, I'm not really sure, and maybe we can revisit this conversation 3 years.
It is.
And in some environments, that's not acceptable. In some contexts or situations, that's not acceptable. And the urgency of a situation kind of serves as a springboard for conflict. So you need to be equipped with some skills, or at least some, I don't want to say canned responses, but at least some understanding that these kinds of lulls happen so that you aren't pushing the issue too much and allowing that to lead to greater issues. Because like urgency is another thing that I think can trigger people. It's like, this has to happen right now.
Yes.
And the other person's like, I don't get it. I don't believe that it does. And that becomes like this major, major issue.
And this is the hardest part for me. I hate inconclusive conversations. I shouldn't say that. I don't hate them. It's hard for me to accept that a conversation is inconclusive and needs to be revisited time and time again, because I love solving problems. Solving problems feels so good to me. And this is probably because of my church background.
I was just about to say, let's go ahead and unpack that while we're here.
I have this subconscious expectation that someone is always in charge of solving problems, making decisions, resolving issues. And I like feeling a sense of control over my life. So when there is a conversation that doesn't go anywhere, I feel this layer of anxiety. I mean, I tend to have an all or nothing approach as a general matter that I'm working on, but if there isn't a clear solution, I feel like the conversation isn't successful. And I will be the type to try to force a resolution, which leads to this superficial commitment or some level of like resentment later on down the line, because I want to feel in control of the situation. Now, I can dial it back by reminding myself that I don't want to have power over whoever I'm talking to, whether it's you or a parent or a friend. I don't want to have power over them. I want to be in relation with them. I want to have this dance that feels good, but it's still very hard.
Yeah, you're reminding me of the conversation we had with our buddy Anthony O'Neill a couple of years ago. I remember being on his show, and we got a lot of attention because I guess of the way I was speaking to Anthony. And till this day, people, will say that that's how they found us.
Yes.
And, they've been following us ever since. But, I think what people were struck by, there were several things apparently. Until this day, I still have never seen the.
I know. It's a good conversation.
I was there, so I don't need to. But the point that I was making to him was in response to one of the questions that he asked, which was around like, how do you fight that urge to always want to win these arguments, these conflicts? And I just flipped it on him. I was like, well, why would you want to be in a relationship with someone who's always willing to lose these arguments or these conflicts? Like, what is it about losers that you're so attracted to?
It was Cat Williams, pre-Cat Williams.
Okay.
Because Cat said the same thing to Shannon Sharp.
Yeah.
In a different word.
Yes.
Because you was like, so you like
losers?
You like losers?
That's
like,
your thing? Because I said it also from a personal standpoint, like that would be so deeply unattractive to me. To be with something that was just comfortable, like just laying over and being stepped on all the time. And I could just raise my voice a little bit and they would fold. Like, I wouldn't want to be with somebody like that. I don't find that attractive at all. And so I kind of challenged him in that regard. And so I don't know where his personal life is now, but shout out to him. And I'm sure he's grown since then. But it just reminds me of that, because I think a lot of people look at these things, which is very American, like win or lose. Like we don't do nuance or inconclusiveness or abstraction at all. It's like black or white, Republican or Democrat, rich or poor. It's like we live on either end of the extreme in all things. And we don't realize that, man, you can get a little swirl on, dude. Like life is gray. It's somewhere in between. And that's okay. Because like that's where you're going to be for the majority of your life. And I think we need to get more comfortable with that and like stop. Like some problems like are just going to be around. If you don't believe me, watch the news or ask a 50-year-old that's been watching the news. It's like, yeah, tell me what was the issue in the 70s? What was the issue in the 60s? What different version, same flavor, but like it's the same kind of
thing. It was Reagan flavored back then.
Reagan flavored Israeli Palestine.
It was Bush flavored. It was just a different
Democratic Republic. It's the same stuff, And so like these issues are ongoing. They don't really go anywhere.
That's right.
Someone adds a different flavored framework to it and makes it a thing, but it's all kind of the same thing. And so, this is in part wisdom for those, me leaning into my 40s as I'm like getting onto the other side and being reminded that this is most likely the halfway mark, right? This is my midlife wisdom kind of kicking in and saying, yeah, you just got to get a little bit more comfortable with it. And you're not really ignoring it. You're just learning to ride the wave.
Right.
And not always try to focus on landing the plane or winning the argument or anything like that.
You mentioned urgency earlier, and I think that's an important part to bring up, because that to me is where you see a lot of the unfair jabs happening, is when the situation is urgent. And the way that I see this conversationally the most is in ultimatums. Like people use ultimatums all the time. And it is probably like the hand grenade of tactics. Because once you pull that pen out and you give somebody an ultimatum, you've essentially made a threat, right? That's what an ultimatum is. It is a threat. It shuts down communication. It creates this power imbalance. It makes the other person feel pressured and resentful. And it's usually, again, when something is time sensitive, when the solution needs to be made, and someone pulls out the, well, if you don't stop doing that, then I'm not going to do this. And if you don't do this, then I'm going to stop doing this. And the difference between an ultimatum and expressing a boundary is the coercion. An ultimatum is actually trying to control the other person's actions by threatening some sort of negative consequence. If you don't stop doing what you're doing, then I'm going to do something that you're not going to like.
Yeah.
And that tone, that approach, I know that some people like it and default to it and say, well, that's the only thing that works. It works because you've now taken power over somebody and you've created this situation where they are doing it without actually being willing to do it. It's a short-term fix.
Yeah. I've come to realize that in many cases, not all, because I do think that there are certainly times where an ultimatum is necessary, like you are literally at risk, like someone or yourself might be at harm. But more often than not, what I find is that when people are delivering an ultimatum, it's almost like an expression of them saying, I don't have the tools to navigate this anymore. Like they feel backed into a corner. They feel ill-equipped. And in many ways, it seems almost like an outburst of emotional immaturity. Like, I don't have the skills. I don't have the emotional intelligence to navigate this situation.
And these are my last two options.
And this is my last, right. I'm being boiled down to my basic human instinct of fight or flight. And that, to me, I've come to empathize. And I will say this is more relevant, less relevant with you and I, because you and I think have done the work and are continuing to do the work. I find this more so with a lot of the people that I speak to who are having these kinds of multi-generational conversations. Like, there is a theme that we're realizing, and, her name has come up several times before, but Nedra Tawwab's work with respect to teaching people how to understand and enforce boundaries. But a lot of my friends who are struggling, who are in the sandwich generation, who are having these conversations with their parents, they're realizing in many cases that their parents did not they did not have a version of this when they were growing up. Right. They just were kind of going with the flow. You are better equipped, better skilled, better emotionally resilient than your parents. And so you're entering this conflict with all of these tools, all of these tactics, all this calm nature, and they're interpreting it in a very different way. And so I've learned to empathize, and I would recommend that a lot of people kind of learn how to do that as well. Like, come to grips with the fact that you are better equipped with managing these kinds of conflicts in general than the older or previous generation. But it's also like not just about empathy, but it's about like just negotiation skills and the ability to compromise and to acknowledge urgency and not default to making a rash financial decision, like having a child or getting married because someone is pregnant, or all of these things that are like really, really bad. They don't seem like financial decisions in the moment, but they are really rash decisions
and
that
have
really
long-term
require
consequences.
Thought.
Yes.
And I think we let the other parts of our brain and our own sort of issues that we've had to deal with in the past kind of take over. And I think it leads to a lot of these things. But I think just tactically, like knowing to acknowledge the urgency and say, yes, I understand this is a situation, but I also know that if we lose control, we are more than likely going to make a financial decision that we're going to regret in the future. And so we owe it to ourselves to take a deep breath, several if necessary. Maybe we're not going to be able to solve all of the issues right now, but we can create like a temporary plan to say, all right, at a minimum, we can agree on this. And that's a huge win. Right. And say, all right, we're going to start here, and then we will reassess. And before you know it, you've kind of built this plan that everyone, or at least the most important people who are involved in that decision, have come to some form of agreement with. And then after that, you can schedule a follow-up conversation and so on and so on. Because again, this is not about coming with a plan, speaking your part. What's his name? Oh boy, that we were talking to with Love and Marriage Huntsville when we asked him, Marcel. And I'm not trying to crack jokes on him or Tisha, but we were on that show a couple of years ago, and we asked the question, like, how often are you guys talking about money? He was like, once. We had the talk. I was like, a lot can change. Like, you have a child, you have another child, you move, different job situation, the business is in a different case. Like, you got to revisit that conversation, because I think, need to revisit some of the conversations that we've had in the past, because I think, like, life changes and your plans need to change and evolve with those things. And I think more often than not, we take it as a sign of weakness to reevaluate the plan, when I think it's the exact opposite. It's a matter of fortifying the existing plan so that it works given the new information or the new context that we're living inside.
Exactly. We always talk about respecting our process, respecting the process, the big process, capital P process. But having relationships with other people means respecting their process too.
Yeah.
They have a different one. And when we don't fight fair in this attempt to get someone over on our side, what we're insinuating is that their process is not as valuable as ours. That is why conversations about money, fights about money is not about the money. It's easy to fall into this trap of thinking there is a right answer or a wrong answer. But when you acknowledge that everybody's journey is shaped by their own experiences, their values, their insecurities, you realize that when you are trying to force your way onto someone else, you are not just trying to fix their finances, you're trying to fix them. And that's never going to work through the lens of money. You can't fix somebody that way, and they're not broken to begin with. So the next time you're in a situation like this, where you're having a money conversation or experiencing some conflict financially with someone you love, you really have to step back and ask yourself, am I truly respecting their process, or am I trying to control it? Because those are two different things. If you can find a way to work with who they already are, to your point, use some of the tactics that we talked about, whether it's finding a temporary fix or going forward with your plan by yourself or whatever it is, and you start to see their journey with empathy, then you know you're on the right track. Because at the end of the day, love isn't about changing someone. It's about accepting them with their flaws and all, and deciding if you want to walk alongside them or not. That's up to you. But this idea that you can then like force your way and create this new mold and take pride in that is where I think a lot of people zig where they should have zagged.
I could not have said it better myself.
You really couldn't have. Let's fight about it.
No, let's do that later.
All right, y'all. Well, I hope you learned something from this episode. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular podcast. If you like what you heard, let us know by leaving a 5-star rating or review.
Nah, I'm going to give an ultimatum. Look,
if you don't leave
a 5-star review, I don't know what I'm going to do.
I'm going to stop making, I'm not going to stop making podcasts. See, that's the other thing about ultimatums. Don't let it be a hollow threat. Don't let it be empty, because now you're just teaching them to take you there, and then the conversation ends. Point is, if you like what you heard, got me all distracted, leave a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast platform, or drop a comment below and we'll keep the conversation going. We will see y'all next week.